Well, a full welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We had over 500 social workers from across the state register to join us for today's 2024 legislative recap. Every year, the NASW Minnesota chapter does this little session of kind of recapping what happened at the Capitol from a social work perspective, specifically looking at some of the issues that we've been following as a chapter and some of our policy priorities and the things we were working really hard on this year. And as you'll hear momentarily, and some of you, if you've been following us and reading, if you're members, you're reading our newsletter. If you're not members, hopefully you're seeing some of the content on our website and our advocacy updates, but there has been a lot moving this session and we have made some really fantastic progress. So I'm sure some of you are here because you heard about some of the really cool things that we got done this year. You want some of the specifics, so we will go into those. My name is Karen Goodenough. I'm Executive Director at NASW Minnesota, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Jenny Arneson, who is our contract lobbyist with the chapter and really is the voice of social work at the Minnesota State Capitol. Jenny works for the chapter mainly. We're kind of the big holder of the contract, but we also partner with several other social work organizations that help chip in to pay part of Jenny's contract. So I just want to first thank all of our coalition partners with the Coalition of Licensed Social Workers. So we have this cool thing in Minnesota that most states don't have, where all of our social work groups come together in this coalition and work together on policy issues, specifically things that affect the profession and licensing and that sort of thing. So I want to give a quick shout out to our friends at the Minnesota Nursing Home Social Work Association, the Minnesota Society for Clinical Social Work, the Minnesota School Social Workers Association, the Minnesota Hmong Social Workers Coalition, and the Minnesota Association of Black Social Workers. All of those folks work with us in coalition, in partnership throughout the year, and we specifically meet one Wednesday morning a month, which happened to be this morning, and put our collective heads together, and we all chip in to help support our policy efforts together also. So thanks to all of our coalition partners. Just a couple of housekeeping-y things some of you might be wondering about. So the session is being recorded. You will only show up in the recording if you unmute yourself to speak. So even if your camera's on, which is fun to see some of your faces, you won't show up unless you unmute yourself. We will be sending the recording out to everyone who registered for today's session. We will also be posting it on the NASW Minnesota YouTube channel. If you watch that session on YouTube or anything else we have up there, which we have a lot of cool things up there that are all free, if you watch them, you can count them as independent study CEUs. And just a reminder that folks, you can get half of your CEUs every renewal period through independent study. So it's a great way to meet those CEU requirements. After today's session, Miley Vu, who's in the background here, Miley is our program and events coordinator at the chapter, and she will send you all a copy of the slides, your CEU, the evaluation, and again, a link to that recording. I want to also let you know that we will pause after each section of content, and Jenny will take questions at that time. I will be fielding the chat, and that's where we're going to ask you to put any questions, comments, things you'd like to say along the way. Please try to use the chat mainly for questions for our presenter. It helps everyone be able to pay attention and not have kind of a side conversations going on in the chat. We do only have an hour today. Just to note that some of the topics we will talk about today, we will be holding some follow-up sessions later in the summer, early fall, to bring you all up to speed on more of the details as some of these policies come together and get launched. With that, I just want to give a huge shout out to our policy committees at NASW. This work is not done by just Jenny. It's not done by Jenny and I. It is done by a massive team of our folks who are our members who chime in and help do the work. So we have two committees that do our main policy work at the chapter. One is our SPAN committee, our Social Policy Action Network. And that's the group that writes our legislative agenda, follows bills, puts on day at the Capitol, does, really the heavy lifting on our policy work. So I want to thank Sarah Bush and Angie Danowitz-Johnson, who co-chair that group, as well as all of our active SPAN committee members, who I don't have time to name all of you, but really fantastic crew of people who work on this stuff all year round for all of us. And the other group is our PACE committee, and that is our PAC. So you're going to hear about this in just a little while from Joshi, our intern this summer, but PACE is the group that decides who our endorsements are as an association in Minnesota. And those endorsements are our friends at the Capitol. And those are the people then Jenny can go to and knock and say, hey, we endorsed you. We need your help with this thing. And it matters. It helped immensely in our work this legislative session. So I want to lift up the work of both of those groups. And if you in this room are interested in getting involved with either of those groups, we would love to have you join us when we get things started up again in September. So there will be a push for an option to join any of our committees, work groups, affinity groups at the chapter coming in August. And I would encourage you, if you've got some policy interest that you want to, grow these skills or share your skills, we would love to have you with us. So with that, I would like to turn things over to our fantastic Jenny Arneson, who made it all happen this year. Jenny, thanks so much for everything up front here that they're going to hear about in a second.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. This is quite the record of attendance. So we have a lot of people and a lot of things to cover. So we're going to do our best. I see that Zoom kind of erased my kind of headers. So I go by use she, her pronouns. And like Karen said, I work with NASW, and I'm honored to represent social workers at the Capitol. So we did a lot of good work this session. All right, and I will also mention, there's no way we can cover everything that happened at the Capitol, but in addition to questions, if you have an issue that you wanted to just highlight that's related to something we're talking about that passed or didn't pass, you can sure add that in the chat, and we'll mention that as well. There's lots of things that happen at a session, in any given session. All right, so NASW, like we mentioned, NASW has a committee called SPAN. They're in that top right-hand corner picture there, and they work with our policy team in developing and supporting our legislative agenda. We led some initiatives that we're going to talk about today. So what that means is social workers developed the language and led the advocacy. So that's some of the things we're going to talk about today. Other things were led by different groups, and SPAN and NASW, we lifted it up because it aligns with our values or it benefits the people who work with us or our clients. I want to emphasize the results we are talking about today became about because of advocacy. So thank you to all of you in this room who wrote a letter, who responded to one of our calls to actions, who came to Social Work Day at the Capitol, or just found another way to elevate some of the things we were working on. This is, it's always really important. You can save the date for next year, just to make it an annual tradition. We're always trying to perfect this tradition, and we want to perfect our systems so that it can also be meaningful and rewarding for you. And it really does matter as we move things forward. So we will see you next year at our Day at the Hill so that we can talk more about all the things we passed next year. But back to this year, I think it's important that we provide some context for this legislative session. Let's set the stage. This was a short session. First of all, it's about 6 weeks shorter than it was last year's. Last year was a budget year, and next year will be a budget year. So this was a much shorter session, and their focus was policy and bonding. Ironically, they did not actually pass a bonding bill. A bonding bill requires 2/3 vote. 2/3 of the bodies need to vote, which means it does need essentially bipartisan support in order to move forward. The Republicans said they wouldn't offer any bonding votes until the DFL compromised on issues that were not related to construction. And it really centered around this DFL proposed constitutional amendment on equal rights, which included specific language about pregnancy, gender, and sexual orientation. It ultimately did pass in the House after several days of debate, but it wasn't ever taken up in the Senate. So in regards to the Senate and related to equal rights, the conclusion of that bonding and the equal rights is really just kind of indicative of really how the session ended and some of the circumstances in the Senate. So the DFL has a majority in both the House and the Senate, but barely, just by one vote in the Senate. And this year in the spring, about sometime in April, Senator Mitchell was arrested, and she's a member of the DFL party, and that really threw off the delicate balance, the party balance there. Incidentally, she's not the only one who's been arrested this year, but the circumstances surrounding her arrest are much more unusual. They're felony, they're burglary, it's a really unusual situation. So she was arrested, and that really did throw off the balance. And so what we saw in the final weeks of session was extensive speeches and amendments by the Republicans. Some might call that filibustering. Meanwhile, ride sharing had a disproportionate amount of attention from the DFL members. And there was a lot of emotion attached to the Uber and Lyft proposals. For example, the Senate, in that final week of the session, the Senate stopped working for an entire day. It was the day before the session ended because the senator had walked off, right? In connection to the Uber and Lyft bill, and wanted that resolved before he was willing to vote on other bills. So there was a lot of emotion, a lot of kind of challenges in ending the debate. So in the end, how they moved a number of things forward is the DFL created one really large bill. It's called an omnibus bill, and some started calling it the omnibus prime bill because it was so large. It was over 1,400 pages, and it included multiple bills that were already omnibus bills. There's multiple subjects, and already really large omnibus bills were combined into one bill that was passed in the final 20 minutes or so of the session. And so at the end, there was a lot of yelling and a lot of party line votes in the end. So you're going to see a lot of references to this one bill, and it's this large omnibus bill. So that's how that was. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. This context of this session. The first legislative priority, though, what we're going to get to right away is our workforce related priorities. We always want to elevate and diversify our profession. So we are so excited. This is, maybe some of you are here because of this, but we're so excited to announce that our compact passed. This was included in that final big omnibus bill that passed in the final moments. And this bill had a lot of ups and downs throughout the session. So in many ways, kind of the nail-biting finish is really fitting to this bill. We do not nearly have enough time to go into all the drama that led to the bill, but I'm here to say it passed. That is what matters in the end. It passed. So Minnesota doesn't have a strong history at all with compacts. So we partnered with 6 other groups, some of whom have been working on compacts for many, many years. So that was one of our main strategies. I do want to get just a little bit into some logistics. This is a brand new compact. So what that means is that we get to be part of that inaugural commission. They have not yet formed a commission. They will start this fall. And any state that passed it this session gets to be part of this inaugural commission. And what they're going to do is they're going to set fees and some of the basic rules. We needed at least 7 states to pass it in order to form such a commission. Now, social workers, we just blew that out of the water across the country, and we had 26 states. So already more than half of the states have already passed this, and it hasn't even formed yet. So it's going to be a really big initial commission. It is going to take them a little bit of time to get it together. So what that means for you as a social worker is it's going to be at least a year and perhaps 2 before you get to actually apply for and have that multi-state license in your hand. Your multi-state license will be good in any other state that also has passed a commission. So we know for sure it will be good in 25 other states, including Iowa and South Dakota, but know as well that there are more states who are passing this as well. For example, Wisconsin had some legislation this year that didn't quite make it through, but they have a little bit of time because they're bringing it back next session. North Dakota has plans. So we do know that our surrounding states have plans to move it forward. And there's many other states who will be wanting to move it forward as well. I suspect there's going to be some questions on this, but I'd like to just move forward to at least the other main thing that we passed this year, and that is our licensing process. This is a huge transformational change to our profession. And it's also in that very, very large omnibus prime bill. So now the deal is social workers, we have a choice between 2 pathways for licensure. And I just want to show you a visual here that I think will help. So on the left is the undergrad path if you have your BSW, and on the right is the graduate path if you have your master's or another advanced degree. The inset on the left there is the newly expanded provisional pathway. So currently an exam is required for most applicants. You probably know this. If you applied for a license, you probably currently were required to take or are about to be required to take an exam. And that is denoted by the stop signs on this graph, right? Whenever there's a stop sign. So now the new legislation allows anyone to be also eligible for the provisional pathway, which is the inset. So it creates an option for additional supervision in lieu of an exam. So now think about it. You reach the stop sign, you've done all the things, you've gotten your degree, and you reach a stop sign. Right? So currently you can choose at that stop sign. You can take the exam, or you can kind of move up to the provisional license, which says you would need to do an additional 37.5 hours of supervision, and you need to do it not just in a week, it'd be over a period of 1 to 3 years. And after you complete either the exam or that extra supervision, then you would move on to additional supervision, right? So those are kind of your choices now, right? So just kind of going back here, this is going to take effect October 1st, and this will be administered by the Board of Social Work. This is eligible any licensing category. So any licensing category that has an exam, you can choose to do a provisional license pathway instead. So both of these things are two of the topics that we're going to have. NASW will offer more in-depth topics so we can really get into all the specifics. Looks like Karen, you want to say something?
I just want to say just a couple things. I'm getting some questions from folks. One is that roadmap that Jenny showed. I know it's hard to read. We'll send a copy of that out with all today's materials. Just an aside, this provisional licensure path we've had in Minnesota for quite some time, about, what is it, Jenny, 15 plus years now.
Yes.
It had been an option for people who were foreign born and speak English as a second language. They had to take the exam once, and if they failed, they could come in through this alternate path, which offered licensure instead of an exam passage, doing these 37.5 hours of supervision instead. And what we basically did was expand that to anyone and take out that failing once requirement. So anyone at any level of licensure, if the exam for whatever reason does not feel like a good pathway for you, you've tried it, didn't do well, or it just is not what you want to do, you could apply and come in through this alternate path instead. This will start on October 1st. And this is one that we will definitely have a session on more of the specifics coming up. The Board of Social Work did send out an e-blast to all social workers end of last week also, and they'll have more information on their website as well. But most important thing is we are really the only option outside of a couple of states who've eliminated the exam requirements. We are one of the only states that has really an optional path to licensure aside from passing the exam. I do want to say up front, though, really important when we're talking about the compact and provisional licensing, that the compact currently requires you to pass the exam in order to get a compact license. And so if you want to get a compact license, you're probably going to have to go that exam path until we get our provisional path approved by the commission, which could happen. So we'll take some questions on this one later. I just wanted to fill in a little bit more detail on that one before we keep moving. And I'll read your questions, folks, and then we'll come back around after Jenny keeps going here.
That's right. Yeah, this really is a transformational change to the profession, and one that we are really excited about. And it's just really a big deal. And the fact of the matter is we really only worked on it this session. So it's really quite remarkable that we were able to, you think about kind of the embedded culture of standardized tests in our kind of society. And so it's a pretty big deal that we were able to push through kind of this countercultural idea that this is not the only way to prove competency in a profession. And our note that we had absolutely bipartisan support. It did end up in this gigantic omnibus bill, but actually earlier in the evening, there was a House vote and it passed unanimously. So, and we had Republican authors, we had Democrat authors. This was a really popular idea among many, many different people. So we're really pleased about this. And we navigated all kind of the roadmap, the landmines of the context that I mentioned earlier. And there were plenty of landmines that had nothing to do with our bill. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about school social work. We've worked on for a while on school social work issues, and we had some more again this year. So this has a lot of text, but I just want to summarize the main idea behind this. So our goal of the profession is to collect MA reimbursement for mental health services provided by school social workers. This is an important income stream that can fund our profession. So this is really about clinical social workers being able to bill for the sorts of services that they could provide in the community in a school and collect reimbursement for the school so that it can turn around and fund the school social work positions. All right, so they've been working on this for many years, like 15, which is why I have that little picture in the end, like 15 years they've been working on this. And DHS has been very resistant to the idea. So last session, we forced the issue and we passed some legislation that required Minnesota at least try and get federal permission in order to collect this reimbursement. And we had a big breakthrough this session where, because we passed this legislation, DHS became much less resistant, far more cooperative, and we made a path forward. Like, we collaborated and made a path forward. And so we passed some clarifying language this year that will increase the odds of the federal agency, which is called CMS, approving our application. So again, our goal is to get approval so that we can bill. The bonus is that we also, at the same time, pass some legislation for community mental health settings that expands billing options for skill training and for mental health practitioners. So those of you familiar with something called Z codes, that's now a big option. If you're a mental health practitioner, you've not currently been able to bill if you do some skill training, and now you can. So those are, again, we're not going to get into all the details, but the point is we got some nice bonuses from that. And now we are expecting this application to move forward. We're expecting it to be successful. And we are expecting to see some implementation by this fall. So some solid billing, we hope, is going to happen in the fall. We also worked on, again, school social workers. Sometimes other people have ideas about our profession that we don't agree with, right? And that pops up. So in those cases, we have to spend energy advocating for no change at all. And that's really what happened here. So last year, resources were dedicated to fund school social work positions. This came out of the K-12 education budget. Some money was set aside specifically for positions we call school support personnel, which includes school social workers, anyone who supports the social and emotional health of kids. And so last year, so we got some money set aside for them. This year, there's a bit of a funding shortage. So lots of people saw that money and had ideas on how maybe they should expand it, how they should spend it. And so we spent a great deal of time sort of fighting back those ideas so we could protect the money for our school social workers. I think the most concerning and time-consuming of those proposals actually came from school counselors, which are part of the school support personnel funding, right? Like, they get part of that money as well. But they proposed legislation that would have mandated ratios for school counselors, and that would have, the certain result would have been, because the funding is not unlimited, would have meant that school counselor positions would have been prioritized over any other school support personnel. Our note, people may not know this, but school counselors are we're not referring to the licensed professional clinical counselors. That's a different licensing process, different training. And usually our school social workers, our clinical school social workers, are usually the only mental health professionals on staff. There's sometimes school linked mental health resources, but usually the school employees are limited to school clinical social workers. So we do think some expansion on this is going to be inevitable, but we're going to keep doing our best to partner with others and keep the intent of expanding support for students' social emotional needs front and center. So we do some collaboration, and in the end, we ended up in a good place with school counselors as well. I note for school counselor friends in the audience. We also, those of you who work in community mental health settings, you probably know that low rates are a huge issue right now, and they're directly related to your pay. If you're wondering how you can get higher pay, higher rates, higher reimbursement rates is a really critical aspect to that strategy. So this is something that we've been working on, especially with our partners at the Mental Health Legislative Network that we also call MHLN. Last year, we were able to get a 3% increase, and this session, we got a very modest increase. This is not a budget year. There were not really budgets or resources set aside for rates, but the difference is this year DHS came out with a report that reinforced really what we know, that you have arbitrary rates, they're very inconsistent, and they're well below what they should be, well below market rate. So they outlined, right, that provided a path. So DHS has recommending higher rates. And then with our partners at MHLN, they proposed a very specific language, a bill on 6 different areas that we could increase rates. They didn't really have the money for that, so they did allocate some resources that will increase the rates, but it's modest. So this will be a continuing subject. We mentioned that these slides will go out, and these links, these hyperlinks, will be available to you if you want to read the report, if you want to read the specific proposals. But here at the bottom, and again, this was in the very big omnibus bill that passed in the end, and this is the final points. There is really where they ended up with the rates. So rather modest. Title protection. So not all of our SPAN priorities passed this session. We've got a couple of really big ones, but we still have some more work to do. So title protection will mean that counties can continue to hire the employees of their choice with or without a social work degree, but they will limit the use of the social work title to those with a social work degree or license, right? This is not to be confused with social work licensing exemptions. The counties are exempt from licensing, which this bill does not address. For better or for worse, this is really just focused on the title, and the counties are also exempt from the title exemption as well. I want to be clear that we do not think social work, our position is not that social workers are more important than other employees in the county. Rather, we just think our training is unique. That's been our position. And we think it's important because we think our degree and our training matters. The county is essentially telling social workers, and only social workers, that our degree and the title that comes with it is replaceable with virtually anything. And this impacts our pay and our professional status. That's really our position on title protection. So that's what we've been talking about. And it's not well understood at all. Like, we have had many, many conversations with legislators who have no idea. And in fact, some of them were opposed to removing our licensing exemption because of county interactions they've had with different county employees who may or may not be social workers. So we know it's really confusing to the public, and we just think it's more transparent. So that has been our position, and we're always evolving, and there's a lot of conversation about it, but we know that there is some, and culture change takes some time. So we're willing to engaging. There's a lot of, we're not tied to going about this in a certain way, but we do think it's a conversation worth having. We have some strong support from our authors, and we did have some initial opposition from unions like ASME. They're now a little bit more interested in talking to us about it, again, because this does impact people's pay as well. And we are looking to elevate this among county commissioners. We had Hennepin County was pretty neutral on it. We know Scott County's neutral. There's a lot of counties who are pretty neutral or open to the idea. And we do think there's a path here, and we would love your support in engaging with us and talking to others about it. So that'll be something we keep talking about. Paid internships. This is an issue that we know this is a huge barrier to completing the degree. Like, we know this is a big issue for many of you who really want to talk about this. And really what this comes down to is this is a resource issue. Funding paid internships, the way we wanted to go about it is using the higher education budget and giving money directly to colleges so that they can pay stipends to students who are in different programs, including social work. That just takes an inordinate amount of resources, and they just haven't had the money to do that. Most of the higher ed resources last year and this year went to the North Star Promise, which does, to be fair, right, does open about eight BSW programs with a full scholarship. So it does reduce barriers, just not through the paid internship. So it's, the trade-offs, I guess. We are watching a couple of smaller programs that we think can provide some good data for us and some good ways to keep this conversation going, some good openings. Specifically, that school support personnel money that we just talked about, that we defended, that part of that money is meant for a pipeline program. And so, in fact, schools are being provided direct money for students who want to do an internship in a school setting. So and that's taking effect this fall. So there are some students who are going to be placed in schools, and they will have a paid internship through this funding. The other big one that passed this year is in the education bill. They put in money for paid student teacher positions. They did not have enough money to fund it. It takes millions of dollars, right? It takes 6.5 million even to do a pilot program. And they're just doing 8 colleges and a certain amount of students, right? So they're going to do a pilot, but they are going to collect some data, which we hope would be helpful. We imagine will be helpful as they do a survey and do some research on the benefits that it provides higher ed students who are trying to finish their degree. So before I move on to our next legislative priority, this is a good time for us just to pause. And we have, a minute or two if we want to just ask any clarifying questions.
Jenny, the chat, both privately to me and the public chat, has been blowing up with questions on all of these things. So I think what we should probably do is talk through the rest of our priorities and then come back. And Jenny and I are both committed to sticking around for a little while longer to answer more questions. Again, some of those answers will be on the recording, and we will host some updating sessions on both of these as well. But I don't think it'll help us right now, Jenny. We're going to get real in the weeds.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Especially if you have kind of specific, like circumstantial questions around, or like which schools, all those sorts of questions. Like, yeah, that's good. Okay. Let's do talk about some of these other things. So SPAN, like I mentioned, and these are important, right? Because, well, these upcoming slides are not really directly about our social work license or our workforce. They are about our clients. And our SPAN committee gives a lot of thought to elevating certain priorities based on what they think might be happening and where they think it'd be appropriate to have a social work voice. And one of those areas is child protection. And I'll just kind of sum up our with 4 words, our position on child protection: less trauma, more reunification. That's really SPAN's position on child protection. And we look, and there's a lot of different circumstances, a lot of different policies that came forward this year. So this idea of college scholarships popped up this session. So last session, they allocated some money specifically for college students who've been in the foster care system during their teenage years. And they allocated money so that those people could go to college with a full scholarship. This year, they realized that there was more demand than money, and they wanted to address that. So they did pass some funds to close the gap between the anticipated applications and the money available, so that they won't have to turn anyone down. I think it's like 600 people or something like that. Second, the idea of the African American Family Preservation Act has been around for quite a while, actually, and this year it passed. So that's a pretty big news. And the idea behind this bill is it recognizes that African American children are removed from their families at vastly disproportionate rates, and it stipulates a range of protections to try and address that issue. This did pass in its own bill, like both of it. So it's a little bit it's unusual for things to pass not in a giant omnibus bill. So it means that this is a little easier reading if you want to look this up and to kind of read more specifically about all the various protections that are now in place. I also will mention, not on the slide, but there was a lot of attention this year on reporting, the child protection mandated reporters and the reporting process because of media attention this winter on child protection. So we did see some reaction to that, but there was some of that was disrupted because a lot of that work had been led by Senator Mitchell, who I mentioned was arrested. So that some of that work did not come through. However, some of it did. So one worth mentioning is the Supreme Court Chief Justice is now authorized to create a council on child protection, and their job is to create a blueprint to reform the child protection process. All of it, right? Like a huge thing. It doesn't name social workers as members of that commission, but it does specifically say that it needs to include professionals with experience in specific aspects of the system. So I'd encourage you to kind of keep, that's an area that you work in, or you have some experience, guardian ad litem, working in the child protection system, being a part of if you've had any experience with the child protection system, give it a look and you can consider applying for that. Second, there was a lot of attention on a bill brought forward by Representative Nash, who's had some personal experience and trauma with child abuse himself. And so what that resulted was that bill will increase the penalties for people who interfere with others trying to make a child protection report. So there'll be increased penalties if you're like a supervisor or a principal or work in some sort of setting and somebody comes to you and says, wants your advice, basically, or doesn't want your advice, right? And like, I'm going to make a child protection report, and you try and stop that person from making the report, there will be penalties, financial and otherwise, if you interfere. So that's probably going to result in more reporting, which leads us to what didn't pass this year. So on the right hand, I'll cover that first. That was, we were really backing with our friends from the Institute to Transform Child Protection, this idea of a fiscal analysis. And we know in social work and in child protection that there tends to be a focus on the reporting part, which leaves less resources and less attention and energy for the intervention, and just really leads to more trauma and more removal, which, if you recall, is the opposite of our legislative agenda. So we really appreciated this idea of a fiscal analysis, which was meant to consider that, look at the child protection system, but really an overall, a more comprehensive way, including identifying concrete resources so that at all aspects, the whole continuum of child welfare, not just child protection, but child welfare, could be better supported. We don't quite know what happened to that. The way the process works, it was included, it made it into the final omnibus bill, but the way the process works is these conference committees form and they don't always meet in public. There's a lot of backdoor negotiations and things just kind of get removed, and we don't always know why. And that happened here. So we're learn more from our partners and hopefully support that in the future. The other thing that we wished could have moved forward and it just really didn't really get off the ground was this idea of an alternative response to educational neglect, just so that families don't have to automatically end up in the child protection system when it's a situation of educational neglect. We wanted to give the counties a little bit more flexibility there to intervene, again, aligned with our priorities of less removal, less trauma. Okay, our pause if anyone has any questions on child protection or any additions that they want to mention.
I haven't seen any on child protection, Jenny,
Right.
but a couple notes to ask you to slow down. I know you're a speedy one, but yeah, try to slow down so people can track with you.
I'll do my best. Okay, next then, we're going to move on to disability justice. All right, we joined other people's efforts. This was an issue for us last year, and we brought it back again this year. There's a pretty large coalition, and what they want to do is phase out 14C, it's called, which is the practice of paying people below minimum wage in certain work settings. So really, minimum wage applies to everyone except for people with a disability in certain work settings. So this kind of an old-fashioned term would be sheltered workshops, right? The idea that you're kind of in a factory assembly line, right? And you're paying people pennies on the hour to just kind of put together widgets. Like, that's what they're trying to phase out. Last session, they did get a lot of money, which was really helpful in providing support to groups that wanted to, or companies that wanted to voluntarily stop this practice and needed some assistance and kind of getting those supports in place, but they didn't end the policy. So this year there was renewed efforts to try and say, this really, you just need to stop this. This needs to not be allowed. So we joined those efforts. It had strong opposition last year, and I would say this year that this opposition doubled down. And so with the turmoil, I mentioned the context of this turmoil of DFL votes and the leadership turnover, Representative Fisher from the House, who is kind of leading this efforts, really just didn't have the political backing he needed it to get it through Senator Hoffman, who is leader in the House Senate, through, right? So that's really what happened there. So it did not pass. It was not included. So the House brought it forward to their conference committee and their final report, and the Senate really was not interested in moving it forward. And in the end, like I mentioned, the House didn't have what they needed to move it forward. So that is something that did not move forward this year. Or pause, because that's really what I've got to say about disability wage justice, unless someone has additions or other sorts of bills they wanted to lift up in that area.
I haven't seen anything yet. I'll give people a moment to think if there's something they want to drop in the chat. I want to go back just one section, Jenny, because we had one comment about the child protection policies you were talking about, and someone had said they'd love to know more about how supervisors should be supporting supervisees in navigating ethical decision making about when to report and how exactly interfering would be defined so that we're protecting ourselves from penalties and helping supervisees determine ethics and legalities and that sort of thing. It is definitely gray. And I just want to say a couple things. One is we have a session coming up in August with Miriam Itzkowitz from the Center to Transform Child Protection, who will do another ethics training on mandated reporting through a trauma responsive and racial justice lens. And I think we'll ensure that Miriam talks about how this all sort of weighs into the conversation now as we're going forward. So just please look for that, folks, if you're interested in details about how this will play out, and definitely something that we'll circle back with you as we know more. Let's see, someone had said, yeah, the sheltered workshop issue is really complicated. Let's see. Someone says, I'd like to get more information about the Institute to Transform Child Protection because Jenny mentioned it during the CPS section, sat in on one of their meetings at MSSA, and it seems they're rarely accompany a parent during a court session, that sort of thing. So yeah, we'll circle back on that. I think that's really a good question, and we can come back to that as we're working with them in the next over the summer and next legislative session also. And then Miley put the link to that session there.
They're really our partners. They're really, I would say, our top kind of partner in the child protection arena, the Institute to Transform Child Protection. So as we mentioned, they do some training. So they've been a solid trainer for us, and they're really the best person to bring your questions about how to navigate that supervision, right? Like policy isn't really intended ever to get into the details of how to live your day-to-day life. It's really more about ideas and values being written down. So we can look at the language to try and figure out like in what circumstances you could be penalized, but at the end of the day, reporting has always been gray, which is why it's really our kind of as social workers, our position is kind of not to try and lean too heavily into them. It's important, mandating reporting is important, but you don't want to, the problem with legislation is it tends to get really stuck in that reporting area. And it sometimes gives the impression that if you just have lots and lots of reports, we will somehow solve, right? Like that everybody will be safe. Everyone will be more safe if we just have lots and lots of reports. And we know that that is not really the case. So it does tend to oversimplify it, and it's a really emotional issue. So and certainly if you heard Representative Nash, you would certainly understand why this legislation passed and why it got so much support, because of course he had a personal story that was connected to that. So anyway, they do some training, the Institute to Transform Child Protection. They also have a legislative arm, so we lift up many of their policies. And to that point, the third thing that they do is they do some direct, I think, representation as well. So they do show up in court as well and try and particularly help families. And they're very aligned with our mission of trying to keep families together with less trauma. So that they do a variety of different things, and they're associated with William Mitchell Law School. So they have some legal, so they have a kind of a combination of social work and a legal background as well. All right, so let's move on. Let's move on to housing stability. So we focused on policies this year over money because it's a policy year. And unfortunately, neither of our big priorities passed, but I do want to spend a moment talking about it because they're certainly coming back next session as well. So both of these policies, what they have in common is they're highlighting disagreement, not by party. So many of the issues we hear are really just people vote along party lines, but this really isn't a party issue per se. There's disagreement rather by community, and particularly suburbia, right? Like particularly suburban legislations. There's a lot of angst when it comes to housing policies, and you see a lot of differing philosophies, rural, suburbia, urban, and about affordable housing. And it really put front and center this issue of who we will allow to be our neighbors. And so when you hear about affordable housing projects in communities, often you hear a lot of emotion and a lot of just a lot of emotional fights when affordable housing projects move forward. And that happened here in this session, right? It wasn't about a particular project, but rather this idea of where we can build housing, what rules should be in place, and who gets to live there. And so that became, as you can imagine, emotional as well. So the first one was specifically about Section 8 vouchers. That's the source of income protection. And they were trying to pass legislation that says you can't be discriminated against if you have a Section 8 voucher, right? Like you can't have a rule that says, I don't take Section 8 vouchers. And that did not pass. The second one was about land use. And that's really about zoning and eliminating reasons or excuses that cities use, like they currently use, to kill affordable or supporting housing projects. And they often cite zoning, they cite rules, right? They cite process, but it's really, we know it's used much more frequently with housing projects that might house people who need affordable housing or need supportive housing. And there's a lot of case studies. We did some call to actions about this earlier. Both of these issues died because of opposition within the DFL party. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of Republicans who oppose this as well, but I just want to kind of highlight this because, of course, the DFL does have a majority, and there was opposition. There's not alignment because, again, this is often community by community. There was strong, especially with the second one, there was really strong opposition from the League of Minnesota Cities, which is the group kind of like us, like an umbrella group that supports cities, right? So a lot of cities came out and strongly opposed this idea and put a lot of pressure on their legislature. And in fact, we did see some very specific people. In this case, Senator Latz and Senator Gustafson are the ones who ended up making the move to make sure it didn't move forward, even though I'm sure there were others who didn't like it as well. And it was particularly hard, I think, because it was a nasty fight and there were just a lot of ugly comments that were made during committees and hearings that just don't align with our social work values. But we are really committed to staying into this fight because we do understand the impact on our clients. So that's 2 proposals that we worked on this year. But we want to leave you with some good news. So some housing things, that was kind of a depressing slide, but we have some good news in housing as well. We did get a few things passed. So tenants who need to call 911 for a mental health crisis, they now have some protection that they didn't have before. So they can't be evicted for too many 911 calls. Second, there are some protections for people who need to move suddenly because of violence. And then there's some new resources for housing as well, much more modest than last year, but last year, a huge amount of money went into affordable housing. So record-setting amounts of money went in. So it's not too surprising that it's a little bit more modest this year. Are there any clarifying questions or other additions on housing?
I have not seen any thus far, Jenny, so I think you can keep moving and people could chime in at the end.
All right. Well, we had just one health initiative this year. This is our health legislative priority section. A priority this year was the End of Life Options Act. This did not move forward this year. It did have some movement in the House. They got heard. There was a couple of committee hearings. It started to move through the process, but ultimately they really just didn't have the votes in the Senate. So the Senate didn't move it forward, which means at some point the House stopped moving it forward and they put energy into other things that they knew could pass. Looks like there is a question on this one, maybe. This is my only health one. So if there's a addition or clarifying question on health, now is the time.
She put her hand down, so we know that person. If you've got a question, you can drop your hand up again, or you can drop it in the chat also.
Our mention as well, not mentioned in health. health covers a lot of areas, including insurance. And there was a lot of discussion about pre-authorization and the reform of pre-authorization, which I think did move forward. And so there were many other addition, like insurance sorts of reforms this session as well. So if that's something of interest, you can dig into that further as well. And that ended up in the very large 1,400-page bill as well. All right, SPAN also we always prioritize a few things on community safety. We had some things that I think will be of interest to social workers. The first is crime victim services. We were trying to support some additional funding for nonprofits that support victims of crime, specifically victims of domestic abuse, rape, other sorts of violent crimes against people. And so many of those organizations are really struggling. And so we were able to get a very modest, far less than they asked for, increase to that. And that these are groups that were overlooked last year, so they didn't get any money this year. So we did really want to elevate them this year so that they could get some funding. We know that some shelters, for example, have already closed, and we do want to make sure that those can function for our clients. Many of you often are interested in gun reform, and there were a couple of gun reform bills that moved forward this year. This increased penalties for straw triggers was non-controversial, in part because there was a pretty high profile murder of a law enforcement member who was killed by a straw purchase. So that straw purchase is when somebody who's not allowed to buy a gun has somebody else buy it on their behalf and then gets it from that person. So there's now increased penalties for that. We'll have to see the impact. I've seen an article basically that kind of talks about the impact and maybe the disproportionate impact on women, particularly women in violent relationships who might get caught up in the increased penalties on that. But it is a complicated issue, and certainly a lot of guns out there because of straw purchases. The second issue was far more controversial, and that included banning binary triggers. And so that means you like one shot when you press, and I think another shot goes off when you release as well. And so those are currently legal, but they will no longer be legal. Very controversial. That was not supported, generally speaking, by the NRA or any sort of Republican member in the House or Senate. A couple other gun things did not pass. It passed in the House, but not the Senate. The one that comes to mind is state safe storage. There was a bill that would have expected stronger storage than is currently expected for guns. And then it's worth, I think, mentioning as well that there's some harmful training on mental health that is being removed, right? So that's helpful as well and useful for our law enforcement response to mental health. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Joshi. Actually, we have like 5 minutes left, so I'm going to let Joshi talk a little bit about our PACE committee and our PACE process.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joshi Williams, and I am NASW Minnesota's summer intern this summer. I'm working with the PACE committee this summer, and PACE stands for Political Action for Candidate Endorsement, PACE. We're highly dedicated to advancing social workers' policy goals. We inform our members of endorsed candidates, and we mobilize members to support their campaigns and vote. So the endorsement process actually kicks off today. So exciting. Today, June 5th, the filing deadline for many state and local offices was end of day yesterday, June 4th. So that's why we start on June 5th. So candidates will be endorsed based on our endorsement questionnaire. The questionnaire is based on our values and policy priorities and is still open to join. So if you know anyone, reach out to us and we can get you that questionnaire. So we are endorsing in the House races across the state, and any social workers running for any office in Minnesota. Only members can donate to PACE. So when members join or renew their memberships, it allows members to add extra dollars. And so half of the money goes to the NASW National Office, and the other half goes to the NASW state office. So this is our policy front making. When we do this work, literally everything that Jenny was talking about today, the legislators help us because we know them and have helped them through endorsing. So on September 11th, which I believe is our next Lunch and Learn, we will share who the endorsees are. This event is free for members and non-members and will be on our website for those who may not be able to make it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. And the important context that I didn't mention is the entire House is up for re-election this year. The Senate is not up for re-election. They're 4-year terms, but the House, every single member is up. So that's always part of the context in these policy years as well.
And let me just add, folks, that the endorsement questionnaire is going to be automatically sent to everyone who's running in a House race in Minnesota. So you don't all have to email us like this great person that's running for the House in your area, because Josh is automatically sending it to everyone running in a House race. What we do want you to send us is any social worker you know that's running for any state or local office. We are intending to give financial contributions to any social workers that we endorse, and would just love to endorse as many social workers as we possibly can. So if you know someone with a social work degree, a license, a background, etc., like, please send their names to Joshi. And Joshi, can you put in the chat the PACE email so people can reach out to you and get a copy of that questionnaire to pass along? That'd be great. Thank you.
Well, I talk fast, but we got through it all, let me tell you. So we have a moment, maybe a minute for questions. And like we said, it was certainly happy to stick around and talk more as well. But if there's any general questions, we can do that.
Yeah, there have been so many questions throughout the session. So much good stuff has happened, and lots of questions. So a couple of things, let me just come back to real quick. Someone asked about donating to PACE so that Minnesota PACE gets 100% of your contribution. You can always donate directly to NASW Minnesota and specify that you want it to go to NASW-MN PACE, and I can give you the information on how to do that. You can mail a check to our mailing address, which is on our website, and just indicate that that's what you want it to go to. We also take credit cards, and so we can work that out for you. Our PACE committee has not done a lot of specific fundraising outside of that dues checkoff. It is really important that we also endorse at the national level on behalf of social workers as well. So it's great to get the split, but I'm happy to take all of your money for our state PACE efforts too. So send those our way. Jenny, do you want to talk through the useful links or any final things before
I just mentioned they're useful. You should click on them. So it will come in your slide packet. And if you want to read the language, that's the first one. If you want to, look up these chapters that I was referring to, quick, that you can do a Control F if you want to look for keywords and want to skim through that 1,400-page document and look for social work, for example. You can do that. Go to our second link there, our information and call to actions. We have something queued up for you to easily find your representative or a senator and write a thank you note. There's even a draft. We sure would like you to mention that, and you can follow along. It's always a good place to follow along. Session Daily, they do a great job of covering it. If you just want to peruse maybe a key issue that you wanted to know more about and want to get a hot take, bipartisan viewpoint on that. And then, of course, the PACE page that we just mentioned. And this is how you can contact me if we do not get through to your question today.
Absolutely. Just a couple of other closing things. Anyone who joined us late, just a note that we'll send the slides, the CEU, your evaluation, and a copy of the recording, along with that path to licensure map that Jenny was sharing. We'll send that out to everyone after today's session. One other just legislative related thing that I think I want to draw to everyone's attention is that last year's legislative session, a new red flag law was passed in Minnesota. And Miley, can you put the link for the red flag law training that's coming up in the chat? All social workers should know what the red flag law is and what your requirements are related to both mandated reporting and duty to warn. So we have a training coming up with Gary Sherry Schoner. I think next week or the week, I can't keep track any longer. It's coming up soon in June. Miley will put the information in the chat. Again, might be one that you want to look into if you don't even know what the red flag law is, what you need to know, you might be interested in that. All right, you're welcome, everyone. So this is the official end of the session. We're going to stick around for a couple minutes and take specific questions from individual people. And just a note too, that I did go into the chat and tried to answer as many things as I could answer really quickly. But there are many things that I couldn't answer quickly, didn't have a simple answer to them, have a lot of nuance. Thus, I did not try because I didn't have a lot of time. So we're going to cover some of those here if you want to stick around and listen. Otherwise, these answers will be in the recording, and then we'll turn off the recording in just a little bit. And if you want to chime in verbally and not be in the recording, you can hang out for that too. So if you have to go, folks, take really good care. We'll see you coming up soon. Hopefully, the chapter does everything we do related to policy. We do for free for all members and all social workers, but we do need you to be members. So if you're not a member of NASW and you believe in what we're trying to do here related to policy and all the other things the chapter does on behalf of the profession, we would love to have you join NASW. That's my fearless plug, shameless plug, because I have to. That's how we keep this work going. And I want to give a final just shout out to Jenny and all the work that you did this session on behalf of all of us at the Capitol. All right. With that, we're going to go to the chat. There have been, Jenny, just a numerous amount of questions related to provisional licensure and the compact and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to add a few clarifying things, and then we can turn it over for more questions from the audience too. So in both of these, both folks, the compact and provisional licensure, we will have further information sessions on each of these that are standalone. We're trying to do those in partnership with the Board of Social Work and our coalition partners. Either way, we're going to do some things coming up. So let me talk a little bit about provisional first, because that's, I think, most of the questions are coming in. So one thing for everyone to understand is that the provisional licensure pathway is separate from the exam pathway. So if you've already applied for the exam path and you've been, say you're a person who's taken the exam once, twice, multiple times, and you're still kind of in that path, starting on October 1, you'll have an opportunity to start on the provisional path, which will mean you'll pay an additional application fee. I think it's the $35 fee, and start the paperwork for the provisional path. Okay. Now, those 37.5 hours of supervision are specifically for provisional licensure. So it has nothing to do with like your regular supervision. So if you say you took the LGSW exam and you passed, and you've been now working on your clinical supervision hours, when you get done with those clinical supervision hours, you can apply for that provisional path instead of doing the paperwork for the clinical exam path. So hopefully that makes sense to folks. You're basically going to start down that path instead of the LICSW exam or the LISW exam if you're choosing that. Okay. So hopefully that answers some of that. Folks people have been asking about fines and those sorts of things. So it is true that if you've been practicing without a license and you're not in a legally exempt position. So we only really have two exemptions in Minnesota. We have folks who work for the counties. So if you have a position in a county, you are legally exempt from social work licensure. You can get a license if you choose, but you are exempt from licensure, so you don't have to be. The other exemption is if you work for, it's not even actually on the books, but if you work for a federally recognized tribe, you are also exempt from Minnesota state licensure for Board of Social Work because the tribes are sovereign nations and they do their own licensure. Okay, so if you work for a tribe or the county, you wouldn't have to have been licensed. However, if you've been practicing without a license and you're in a position where if you have a degree in social work and you do anything that looks, smells, seems like social work, you should have been licensed during that time. What will happen when you apply for that provisional path is the Board of Social Work could fine you. And the way that they do the fines is they're basically going to charge you for the cost of licensure for the fees you would have paid during the time you should have been licensed. So say you worked for 2 years without a license. You would pay for 2 years of what you would have paid for your licensure fee, just like I've been licensed, I paid my fees, that sort of thing. So they're not these exponential sort of fines and that sort of thing, but it is based on the number of years that you were practicing without a license and what those fees would have been. It is, there's a little flexibility from the board in this, and they're doing a little bit of, Jenny and I were asking them about this last week in a meeting, like, how will this work? Are we sure? Do we have to? Because we had been asking them to please add to the legislation to not charge fees for people who'd been practicing without a license. They weren't interested in that, but say that they have the option to charge fees. So I don't know what that will mean exactly once y'all start applying, but that is possible. I'm trying to think, is there anything else on provisional licensing that people have questions about? Let me just see here. Someone said, who will be providing the 37.5 hours? Will there be a curriculum or require content? No, it's pretty open in terms of, just like our regular supervision hour requirements don't have a lot of detail in terms of what have to be in them. There's a few little check boxes of things that you have to attest to that you talked about: ethical practice, you talked about scope of practice, you talked about, there's a few things depending on which level of licensure you're in. But it will be, the who is an approved supervisor. So just like those folks that you're looking for right now who've completed the supervision requirement, the 30-hour requirement, and have attested with the board that they're an approved supervisor, they can provide this provisional supervision as well. In terms of group, individual, Jenny, am I remembering that it's the same as what it is right now and it's a mixture? Is that true? Or is it individual only?
It's the same as regular licensing. I don't recall what that is, but
Okay.
if it's like 50% for regular licensing, it's the same. They conformed them.
Okay, so here's what I just put in the chat is the link to the current provisional licensing stuff. You should look in the new statute for the details. The Board of Social Work is working out communications about this, so there will be more information coming out with all of the details on it before that October 1st start for options.
Yeah,
okay.
And it's worth.
Go ahead.
I would just say that not to get like all the details on what is currently written. Maybe don't get too attached to it, because part of this legislation, we move. It's a very wonky term, but we moved the chapter, right? It somehow ended up in its own chapter. Provisional licensing was in its own chapter of legislation, so we moved it to be in the same place as our regular. So it's licensing is all in one place. So there have been, and there was the intent is to conform with the regular licensing, like the hours, the ability to do face-to-face or electronic supervision. It's all similar. So don't get too freaked out if you see something on there and you're like, that is so wrong. Like, it very well, like, that might have changed. Yes. And that's really the details that I think the Board of Social Work is looking for, just a little bit of grace in getting that kind of updated.
Which is why they have that October 1st start. So often when legislation passes, it has like an August 1st start, often when it's licensure related for us, but they asked for it to be a little further out so they could get all these details done. Currently, all of the provisional applications and paperwork and things are all done by paper still. They've not gone electronic, so they're trying to go electronic before this gets opened up. So they have some work to do to figure all this out. Someone who asked about how this fits with the sort of normal 200 hours or 100 hours of supervision, depending on which level of licensure. So again, for provisional, anyone at any level of licensure is eligible to come in through the provisional path. Remember, this is just in lieu of the exam. So it's basically like exam or 37.5 hours of supervision. Once you've done one of those things, you then begin your regular supervision requirements. So this is completely separate from your regular supervision requirements. So think about it just in lieu of the exam. It's really not supervision requirements. Okay.
You've hit the stop sign. You've gotten to the stop sign, and there's a fork in the road, and you get to now decide which fork you're going to choose. But the road, it leads to the same place after the stop sign, right? Like you're all meeting again.
Then you continue
quickly.
on. Do your regular supervision, that sort of thing. The other important thing too is that people could do this multiple times. So say you get done with your BSW, you decide to come in through provisional, and then you get an MSW, you want to come into LGSW through provisional instead of taking that LGSW exam. Then you get to the LICSW and you want to do it there too. You can do this multiple times if you so choose to. So someone asked, Madison says, do we know what the benefit would be of paying to take the exam and then taking it, or is there not one? Is our license any different if we're to take the exam? So yes, let me say a couple things on the paying part. It's very possible that you'd be paying for those 37.5 hours of supervision. So I'm not convinced yet that it's going to be necessarily a cheaper option for people. Depends on who you're getting your supervision from. It also will limit your ability, Madison, at this point to access the interstate compact for licensure. Okay, so if you're a person that might want an interstate compact license, that might be a barrier. You also might run into issues if you move to another state. So say you come in through our provisional path, then you move to another state that requires an exam, you didn't take it to get your license here. Some states will allow you to be licensed because they say, well, you got fully licensed in that other state and we'll take you, just like people who were blanketed in, grandfathered in, that sort of thing. But that may not be true in every state. So you might move and then suddenly have to take an exam, which could stink too. So we want to be super upfront that this doesn't fix everything for people. And a provisional license is a real license. You can practice, fully under that license. But Janelle brings up a good question about, is the exam required for insurance credentialing for LGSW? So our understanding is that insurance requires a license. It does not require an exam. They don't ask how you got the license. They just ask if you have the license. And so our understanding is it should not affect credentialing. Could it in the future? Could they catch wind of this, change requirements? We don't know. So I want to be really honest with people that there's some of the logistics of how this plays out that we don't really know yet. There are some other states, Illinois, for example, this just eliminated exam requirements for everyone. There's a whole bunch of unknown of what that means, right, for practice, and will it have other unintended consequences and things. So we're all learning as we go here. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, no, a couple of things. So first, I really appreciate that question from Madison. My son, Brandon, who might be in the audience, I'm not totally sure, but he's graduating next week with his master's. And we had the exact same conversation a few days ago. Like, why would I take the exam when I have this provisional license? So really the way we talked about it at the legislature is maybe the way you should think about it. Everybody has their own kind of personal work plan, right? Like you have your own circumstances, and it really depends what you imagine your path to be. Like you mentioned, if you anticipate moving a little bit in your career, you might want to take the exam, at least at this juncture. It just depends what you want to do and how, like if you have connections to supervisors where you work, if you're going to be paying or not paying. So a lot of like, you just need to do a little careful analysis of your plan. Yeah. Second, I do want to clarify, I don't think Illinois eliminated the exam for clinical licensing. I think they made a provisional licensing pathway similar to ours, I think.
Okay, you're right. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jenny.
But
you're right. They eliminated it for all the non-clinical levels.
Yes. So there is more than one state, Illinois and Colorado specifically come to mind, who have eliminated the exam for non-clinical licenses. And I will just note that was our original intent. That was our original plan. And the reason we didn't do that is because the Board of Social Work really wouldn't do that, right? Like they were really opposed to not having, and like, they were just opposed. And it was really clear that it was just muddying the water, and the legislature just wouldn't move forward unless we were in agreement about something. And so we both compromised. The Board of Social Work gave some things up. They really wanted to maintain the requirement, for example, that you take and fail the exam before being eligible. And so they gave that up, and we gave up the idea of just eliminating the exam and said, okay, we're do this provisional licensing pathway, but we hold strong on the idea that no one should have to take the exam if they don't want to. So it's really about your choice now. Like what works best for you.
I'm going to answer one more thing on provisional, then I'm going to just do a couple clarifying things on the compact, and then we're going to take more questions. So someone asked, does North Dakota allow provisional licenses? Now, let me be clear. This provisional path, the way we're talking about it today, which is 37.5 hours of supervision in lieu of the exam, is only Minnesota. Other states have a license called a provisional license. It means something completely different. Remember, every state gets to decide their own licensing laws and regulations. So some of us use the same words for different things. In Minnesota, we have a temporary license for people who have passed the exam, but don't have their final transcripts from their schools that allows them to practice. In some states, something like that is actually called a provisional license. So I just want to make sure we're all super clear. None of this has anything to do with what's allowed in any other states. So only think about Minnesota's provisional. Yeah, and someone's asked for reciprocity. Great question, Marissa. I have no idea whether or not someone in the North Dakota board would accept your license, maybe if you were currently still provisional. Maybe once you're done with it, it's hard to say. So that's the part where it's like, you're going to have to kind of play that out. You may want to call the other boards of social work where you are thinking about getting licensed and see. Some states, as I was saying, in terms of reciprocity, allow for anyone who's been fully licensed in one state to get licensed in the other. However you got there, not everyone accepts all of what we allow for. So for example, if you haven't met our 200-hour supervision requirement for a clinician, if you don't meet that, it used to be that Minnesota would make you do more hours of supervision when you apply there, right? Some states still do that. Minnesota, we've now said, if you completed your process, whatever it is in that other state, we're going to allow you, but not everyone allows for that. Okay, so a couple things about the interstate compact, just to clarify from some of the questions that have come up here. One of the main things we have to remember is that you can only access a compact license through your home state. So that map that I put in the chat that shows which states have passed the compact, only people who are licensed in those dark blue states that have passed the compact will be able to access the compact through their home state, okay? So if you access the compact through Minnesota, we pass it, and then you go move to another state that doesn't have the compact, you cannot take that compact license with you there. So it may mean social workers, in the long term, you might be picking where you live based on having access to a compact license. You might also continue down the option that you've always had and will continue to have, which is getting individual licenses in each state you want to practice in. So you will still have that option. So if there's another state you practice in, they're not on the map yet, they haven't passed it, you can still apply for an individual state license in that state. That doesn't go away, okay? Okay, so someone's asking, I've completed my hours and have been approved to take the exam. Do I still have to wait until October? So here's the clarifier on that. And I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, Hawa. You are on the exam path. You said you were approved to take the exam. You are on the exam path. The provisional path, which opens on October 1st, that road isn't even open yet. You're not on it. So you could stay on the exam path and attempt the exam and that sort of thing. But starting October 1, you could then decide to switch paths and apply for the provisional path. Hopefully that clarifies it for you. But you can't just be like, oh, I decided today I'm not going to take the exam. I'm going to do this other one. It's like a new application. The board has been clear. It's like a brand new path that you're starting down.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, with that, anyone else in the audience have questions you want to just raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak, and we can chat a little bit if you're willing to be on the recording. If I don't hear from anyone, I will turn the recording off and then we will be a quiet conversation. Yeah, Maggie.
Sorry. In terms of the like interstate compact being what state you live in, does that mean actually like where you reside or where you're licensed?
It has nothing to do with where you're licensed, Maggie. It has to be where you reside.
It's where your address is. Okay.
Correct.
Cool.
Correct.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, someone else asked earlier, like, I live in Wisconsin, but I have a Minnesota license because I only practice in Minnesota. Can I get in the compact? No, not until Wisconsin passes it.
Right. And
if you live in that other state.
If it were to be like, so I currently live in Minnesota and I'm licensed in Minnesota, but if I were to move to another compact state, I would have to still apply then for direct like licensure in that state if I wanted to practice in both states, because it doesn't matter Yeah.
Correct.
It's
So
like,
once
I'm
you
now
once you
living in Vermont.
move, yeah, once you move to that new state, Maggie, you'll apply for a home state license in that new state, and they're going to
Okay.
make it a faster process to
Right.
continue your compact license. If you already had one in another state, it'll be
Yeah.
some kind of like simpler process, they've said, but that's
Okay.
all part of what the commission has to get the data system going
Right,
and
right. I guess
determine.
all of this is
Yeah.
still like not actually locked in any way.
Yeah. And again,
Cool.
folks, we're
Thank you.
1 to 2 years out from people practicing with the compact license. This is a brand new compact that you got to get the legislation passed before they can even start working on the details. So now they're in detail mode. All right. I saw a couple people come on camera. Anyone else have questions that you want to chime in here before we turn the recording off?
I just want to mention, I saw somewhere on here too, I think we had some Board of Social Work members in the audience. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Welcome. Yeah, absolutely. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close up our recording, and we'll hang out if people have other quiet questions for us. And those of you who are watching the recording, thanks for being with us, and we will see you at one of our upcoming sessions.